At 11:40 p.m., the cold on the North Atlantic had teeth, and the lookout on RMS Titanic had just enough time to see a dark shape before everything changed. The ship was running near full speed, about 22 knots, through a known ice region. On paper, it looked confident. In the water, it looked like a gamble. Edward John Smith, 62, was the captain. William Murdoch had the bridge watch, and somewhere below, ice warnings had already been piling up. That is the part people forget. This was not one sudden surprise. It was a ship moving forward while the warnings kept coming. The sea was flat, the night was black, and the great liner kept cutting on, as if speed itself could make the danger thinner. Then the lookout called down, and Murdoch had about 37 seconds to decide what to do. A head-on hit might have flooded fewer compartments, but that is not how the moment felt there. It felt immediate. One shape ahead, one ship in motion, one tiny window, and no room for a second mistake. If you want more stories like this, subscribe and stay with me. Hours earlier, the ship did not feel endangered at all. By daylight, it felt orderly. Polished wood, steady engines, the faint smell of coal smoke carried through metal passageways. Edward John Smith, 62, moved through command as a man at ease in his own routine. Thomas Andrews, 39, the designer who knew the vessel from keel to deck, was on board as well. Jack Phillips, 25, sat in the wireless room with headphones pressed close, sorting message after message in that dry electric crackle. And this is where the tension starts to tighten. The ice warnings were present, repeated, and easy to treat as one more part of a crowded day. That matters, because when people imagine the loss of the unsinkable ship, they often imagine a single blind mistake. What happened was colder than that. It was a chain, information arriving, being handled, and still failing to slow the ship. All the while, the liner kept driving west at about 22 knots, moving with confidence through a known ice region, with watertight compartments waiting below as if engineering itself could buy more margin than nature would allow. By late evening, the sea had gone strangely calm, and that calm, out there in the dark, was about to hide the one thing everyone most needed to see. So on RMS Titanic, the problem was never one missing warning. It was the way warning after warning could pass through the ship and still not slow it down. Jack Phillips stayed in the wireless room, copying messages while the set crackled in his ears. Out on the bridge, Murdoch had to make sense of a night that had turned flat and black, with the sea so calm it almost looked harmless. That is how the danger works sometimes. Not with noise, but with quiet. By then, the ice warnings ignored during the day had already become part of the background. They were real. They were specific. And they were easier to absorb than to act on, because the liner still felt steady underfoot, and the unsinkable ship still looked like itself from the outside. Below the waterline, the watertight compartments were just steel and dark space, waiting for the moment they would matter. Above them, people kept eating, talking, working, breathing warm air in warm rooms. And that is the awful thing about a ship like this. Everything can look normal, right up to the second it does not. Then, somewhere ahead in the dark, one more message was still coming in. By late evening, the ship had settled into its own silence. Down in the wireless room, Phillips was still working through the backlog. Up on the bridge, Smith had the cold black sea in front of him and warnings ignored behind him. The routine was still there. Lamps, footsteps, the low hum of the engines. But now every ordinary sound felt sharpened. The unsinkable ship was moving through a night that did not care what anyone had called it. And this is the cruel part. Nothing looked broken yet. The decks still held their order. The watertight compartments were still just a design on paper and steel. But the water ahead did not need to hurry. Titanic was doing that for it. At 11:30 p.m., the air was down near freezing. The sea stayed flat. The lookouts had no moonlight to help them, no breaking waves to show where ice might be hiding. Murdoch stayed on the bridge, reading the darkness as best he could. Then, from the crow's nest, one more warning came in. And this one was close enough to matter. On the bridge, the response was still measured. Murdoch had the wheel turned, and the men around him were trying to buy seconds the only way they could, with clean orders, steady hands, and as little panic as possible. But RMS Titanic was already carrying too much speed through the ice, and a ship that size does not change its mind quickly. What looks small from a distance can feel enormous when you are standing there at night. Below, the engines kept pushing. Ahead, the black water stayed flat and unreadable. That is why the ice reports ignored earlier in the day now mattered so much. They were not background noise anymore. They were a map of where the night had been leading all along. And there was something else hanging over the whole ship: the lifeboat shortfall. It was still there, hidden in plain sight, not part of the moment yet, but already waiting behind it. No order on the bridge could repair that now. For a few more seconds, the liner kept going forward into the dark, and the only question left was what the lookout had seen far ahead, and whether there was still time to turn. At 11:39 p.m., the warning finally came from the place where steel and seawater meet human eyesight. High above the deck, in the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet, 24, was scanning the black line ahead with Reginald Lee beside him. The air up there would have cut at the face. No moon, no white water breaking around the ice, just darkness, the cold sting of it, and the sound of the ship pushing on below them. Then Fleet saw it. At first, more like a darker mass inside the dark itself, growing fast as the bow drove toward it. He struck the alarm bell and passed the warning down to the bridge. In that instant, the whole day of ice warnings ignored stopped being paperwork and became one object directly ahead of the liner. Now everything narrows to seconds. Murdoch, already on duty, had about 37 seconds to answer the question the Atlantic had been asking all night. Turn? Hold course? Trust the ship's size? Trust the watertight compartments? The bridge moved at once, but a ship this large carries its own delay inside it, and the bow was still coming on through the freezing dark. What happened next took less time than it takes to explain. Murdoch's instinct was the instinct of a trained officer. Turn the ship, try to clear the danger, spare the bow. On a smaller vessel, or with more distance, that might have worked. But this liner had momentum, weight, and a turning circle that did not care about urgency. The bow began to swing, slowly, heavily, as if the sea itself were resisting. Then came the contact. More a long, tearing encounter along the starboard side, steel shuddering, a deep vibration through decks and bulkheads, a sound many aboard would barely understand in the moment. The bird did not stop the ship. It opened it. And here is the bitter forensic truth. A direct head-on collision might have been survivable. Fewer spaces could have flooded. The ship might have stayed afloat. Instead, that glancing scrape ran along roughly 90 meters of hull. Inside that wound, the real sentence was already being written. Water began entering 6 of the 16 watertight compartments, one more than the design could endure. And before most passengers had even stepped into the corridor to ask what they had felt, Thomas Andrews was on his way down to see what the sea had done. At 11:50 p.m., the truth was already below deck, where the ship smelled of wet metal and boiler heat. Thomas Andrews moved through the damaged spaces with the knowledge only a designer has. Not just what the ship was, but what each flooded section meant to the next one. Water was coming in low and fast, not into one clean opening, but across that long wound in the hull. He did not need panic to understand it. He needed numbers, levels, and the shape of the compartments filling in sequence. And that sequence was fatal. 6 of the 16 watertight compartments had been opened to the sea. The vessel could survive 4 flooded compartments, perhaps 5 in the right pattern. 6 was the line beyond recovery. That single extra compartment is one of the coldest facts in the whole story. One more than the design could bear, and the future changes. Above him, most passengers still had no idea what kind of danger they were standing over. The decks were lit. The air in the public rooms was warm. The great liner still looked like itself. But when Andrews came back up, he was looking at a damaged ship. He was looking at time, measured now not in miles, but in what could be done before the bow went lower. And the next question was about evacuation. From that moment on, every minute aboard the ship had to do 2 jobs at once: stay calm and move fast. The calm was still there on the surface. Electric lights burned steadily, carpets muffled footsteps, doors opened onto warm rooms where people had not yet seen the sea doing its work below them. But under that appearance sat the next hard fact of the night: the lifeboat shortfall. There were not enough places for everyone on board. That wasn't a design issue on paper. It was now part of the emergency itself. Edward John Smith had moved past doubt. Andrews had given him the shape of the damage and the meaning of it. Murdoch's seconds were over. Now the ship entered the longer, crueler phase, where decisions would be measured in loading time, distance, and disbelief. Jack Phillips, still in the wireless room, became more important by the minute because help could only come from outside. And that is what makes this stage so painful to study. The vessel was mortally damaged, but it did not look like a wreck yet. It still looked governable. It still looked, to many eyes, safer than a small boat hanging over black water. Then the machinery of rescue began to turn, and it was already racing the sea. At 12:15 a.m., the ship began reaching outward into the dark. In the wireless room, Jack Phillips wasn't handling routine traffic. Now, every burst of sound in his headset mattered differently. Harold Bride, 22, his junior, was there with him. The room would have been warm from the equipment, close with ozone and metal, while outside, the decks were turning colder by the minute. Inside that small space, the future of the people aboard depended on distance, signal strength, and who was listening. Elsewhere, the evacuation was starting to take shape. But shape is not the same thing as speed. This is where disbelief becomes part of the disaster. A great liner, still lit, still upright, still familiar underfoot, does not feel like a place you must leave at once. The sea below was black and freezing. The boats looked small. For many on board, the ship still seemed safer than the water, and so the lost time multiplied. Smith had moved from command in motion to command in retreat. Andrews knew the margin was shrinking. Murdoch's moment on the bridge had passed, but its consequence was now spreading through every corridor and staircase. Then the distress calls began to travel across the North Atlantic, and somewhere beyond the darkness, another captain had to decide whether those signals meant urgency or the end. Out in the North Atlantic, one ship did answer. Arthur Rostron, 42, captain of Carpathia, received the distress and turned toward the position with all the speed his vessel could give. That detail matters because rescue was no longer a question of goodwill. It was a question of miles, minutes, and freezing water. On board the damaged liner, Phillips and Bride kept working the set as long as they could, pushing calls into the dark while time kept narrowing around them. And still, on the decks, the pace of escape did not match the pace of the flooding. That is another hard truth of the night. A sinking at sea does not feel equally urgent to everyone at the same moment. Some people were moving toward the boats. Others were hesitating, looking back at lit windows, polished rails, familiar staircases. The ship still offered the illusion of shelter, even as the bow settled lower and the cold sharpened in the air. Below, the sea kept taking space, one compartment at a time. Above, command was trying to convert order into survival, despite the lifeboat shortfall already built into the voyage. Carpathia was coming, but coming is not the same as arriving, and aboard the stricken vessel, the next loss was already beginning, not of steel this time, but of power. As the night went on, the ship began to lose the one thing that had made it feel controlled: light. At first, the difference would have been subtle: a colder draft in passageways, a slight new angle underfoot, the sense that doors, rails, and staircases were not part of an ordinary voyage, but part of a machine giving way a little more each minute. Below, the flooding kept advancing through spaces never meant to stand open to the sea together. In the wireless room, Phillips stayed at his post while there was still power to send with. Bride was still beside him. That scene matters because it is one of the clearest human images of the disaster. Two operators in a warm, bright room working against a darkness already moving through the ship around them. On deck, the emergency had changed shape again. It was not only about getting people to the boats, it was about doing it before the liner lost the ability to support the effort at all. Order depends on light, on sound, on visible authority. Once those begin to fail, fear moves faster. And that failure was now close enough to feel. The sea had already taken the hull. Next, it would begin taking the ship's voice, its electricity, and then the last illusion that there was still time to spare. Then the darkness came in earnest. When the power failed, the ship changed all at once from a damaged liner into a silhouette. The electric glow that had held panic back was gone, and with it went the clean lines of corridors, staircases, and deck spaces that had made order possible. What remained was cold air, black water below, and the physical fact of the bow pulling everything forward. For the men still working, that moment closed one chapter and opened the last one. Phillips could not keep sending once the ship lost its voice. Bride survived the night. Phillips did not. Edward John Smith would not survive either. Thomas Andrews, who had understood the mathematics of the damage before almost anyone else, was now trapped inside the same arithmetic. And above them all, the structure itself was reaching its limit. The weight of the flooding had moved too far forward. Steel was carrying stresses it had never been built to carry, in that shape, at that angle, in that sea. You can feel the horror of it even now as strain. A vessel designed to cross the Atlantic was becoming something else. A breaking object in freezing water. Then came the sound people in the boats would remember: deep, metallic, unnatural. And the whole ship began to answer it. After that, the end came quickly. The ship broke its last posture of control and went under in the North Atlantic, about 600 kilometers southeast of Newfoundland. Carpathia arrived in a world the liner had already left behind. Arthur Rostron had turned as fast as he could. It still was not fast enough. Murdoch was gone. Edward John Smith was gone. Thomas Andrews was gone. Harold Bride survived. Jack Phillips did not. The sea kept the final word. What remained on the surface was not the idea of the unsinkable ship, but the evidence against it. Cold water, scattered boats, and the knowledge that speed, pride, routine, and ice warnings ignored had all been allowed to stand together for too long. The disaster was not one mistake. It was a door left open by many hands until the ocean found it. In 1914, the answer came back in rules. SOLAS required lifeboats for all aboard, a 24-hour radio watch, and the International Ice Patrol. The law did what the night had failed to do. It forced caution to stay awake. And now the vessel lies broken on the seabed, far below light and weather, where steel softens into rust and silence. Still there, holding its shape badly, as if the Atlantic is finishing the sentence slowly.